I live in a small ground floor apartment in an older building that was renovated about 10 years ago. The rent is cheap because it's slightly out of the city center and the neighborhood is quiet. Or at least it used to be. The place has its quirks, a few cracks in the ceiling, pipes that rattle whenever the upstairs neighbor runs their water, and a slightly warped wooden floor that creaks even when no one is walking on it. The bedroom window faces the narrow back garden shared by the other tenants. It's a small strip of grass with a few overgrown bushes framed by a rusted iron fence. On summer evenings, I sometimes left the curtains slightly open to let in the breeze. The curtains themselves are thick and heavy, not the flimsy kind you get from big box stores. They came with the place, made from some dense fabric that blocks nearly all light when drawn. They fall all the way to the floor, and there's barely any gap between the hem and the wood. I've never paid them much attention, except to note that they smell faintly of dust and something else I can't quite place, maybe an old, damp closet. The first night, I heard it was in early April. I had been lying in bed for about an hour, scrolling on my phone, letting my mind drift. My building is old, so it's full of nighttime noises, the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen, faint thumps from upstairs, the occasional groan of the walls as they adjust to temperature changes. But that night, I heard something I'd never heard before. It was faint, so faint I thought at first it was just my own breath echoing in my ears. But after holding my breath for a moment, I realized it wasn't me. It was coming from the window, a slow, steady inhalation, followed by a long, dragging exhale. Not a whistle, not a wheeze, more like the sound someone makes when their mouth is slightly open, their lips barely parting as they breathe. I remember lying there frozen, staring at the curtains. My phone's light dimmed, casting the room in near darkness, but I could still make out the vague outline of the fabric swaying ever so slightly. At first, I told myself it was the wind. The garden outside sometimes caught gusts from between the buildings, and if the window frame wasn't fully sealed, it could make odd noises. That was my reasoning as I forced myself to roll over and face away from the window. But the breathing continued. It wasn't rhythmic either. Sometimes it would pause for a few seconds, like whatever it was holding its breath. Then it would resume, quieter but unmistakable. After maybe 10 minutes, I finally got up the courage to get out of bed and check the lock. The window was latched. I even pressed my palm to the glass. It was cold but still. No breeze. And yet, as I stood there in the dark, hand on the glass, the breathing continued, and I realized something that made my skin crawl. It was coming from inside the room, just beyond the curtain. I yanked the fabric aside in one swift motion. Nothing. The dim street light barely reached the garden, but I saw only empty grass, bushes shifting slightly in the wind. I stood there, half expecting a face to suddenly appear against the glass, but there was only silence. The rest of the night, I slept with the curtains drawn back and the lamp on. The next morning, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I'd been half asleep and imagined it. People dream while still awake sometimes, hypnagogic hallucinations, they call them. That had to be it. For almost a week, nothing else happened. Then the breathing came back. This time, it was closer. It started softly around 2 a.m., waking me from a light sleep. That slow inhale followed by a moist, almost sticky exhale. It made the small hairs on my arms rise. I sat up in bed, staring at the curtain. The strange thing was, it didn't sound threatening. If anything, it sounded tired, like someone resting after a long walk. but that somehow made it worse. I didn't move this time. I just lay there, frozen, eyes fixed on the fabric until my vision blurred. Every instinct told me to get up, open the curtain, and prove there was nothing there. But another part of me, the deeper animal part, told me that if I did, something would be waiting, pressed right up against the inside, face level with mine. Eventually, the breathing stopped, or maybe I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. When I woke up in the morning, something was different. The curtains were slightly parted. Not wide, just an inch, maybe two, but I know I hadn't left them like that. That day, I went to the hardware store and bought a cheap motion sensor camera, the kind people use for pets. I set it on my dresser, aimed toward the window. I told myself I'd catch whatever was making the sound, even if it was just the curtain moving strangely in the wind. That night, nothing happened until around 3:15 a.m. The breathing woke me before the camera's motion alert pinged my phone. This time, the sound was wet, as if whoever was behind it had a mouth that didn't quite close all the way. The camera caught something, not a person, not an animal, just a curtain, slowly bulging inward, as though something on the other side was pressing its face against it, breathing into the fabric. The next night was colder than the last. The wind outside moved in heavy pushes, rattling the old wooden frame of my bedroom window. I tried to convince myself that the sound I had heard before had been nothing more than a draft, or maybe even my own mind feeding on my anxiety, but that thought didn't survive long, because as soon as the house went quiet after midnight, the breathing began again. It wasn't faint this time. It was louder and heavier, more like someone trying to inhale through a blocked nose. Each inhale lasted too long, dragging on until it almost hurt to listen. The exhale was slow, damp sounding, and seemed to scrape along the fabric of the curtain. I lay on my side facing the wall, and every muscle in my body refused to move. My eyes locked on a small crack of light that seeped from a street lamp outside, but I could feel the curtains behind me bending slightly, as if being pushed by air from inside the room, not from outside. I knew without. Turning that the window was closed. That breathing was happening on my side of the glass. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could, afraid that the noise of my own lungs might draw its attention. The minutes dragged by, and my pulse thudded so hard I could hear in my ears. Then, in the midst of the deep breathing, I heard the faintest sound, a slow, dragging movement like a bare foot adjusting its position on carpet. I froze so completely that my chest burned from holding air. The breathing did not stop, but it shifted, and I could feel more of the curtains swaying, as if whoever or whatever was behind them had leaned closer to the bed. The urge to look was unbearable. I told myself that if I didn't confirm what it was, it couldn't harm me. That was a lie. I knew it even then, but fear has a way of dressing up lies as safety. I pulled the blanket over my shoulder inch by inch, careful not to make a sound. And that's when I realized something terrible. The breathing had started to match my own. It was almost playful, a second set of lungs inhaling as I did, and exhaling just a heartbeat later, like it was mocking me or learning from me. Somewhere between the slow rise and fall of my blanket, the air in the room changed. I could smell it. Damp, warm, slightly sweet, but wrong, like a mix of mildew and spoiled fruit. It clung to my throat, making me want to gag. The breathing grew shallower, not because it was going away, but because it was closer, far too close. Without thinking, I whipped around to face the curtains. My heart nearly stopped, the folds of fabric bulged unnaturally inward, as if a head the size of humans but slightly too elongated was pressing against it. The fabric twitched with each breath, the shape beneath it perfectly still except for the slow pulse of its chest. The street lamp outside cast faint shadows, but instead of seeing the shape of a nose or mouth, I saw nothing but the faint impression of a gaping opening where a face should have been. I sat up sharply. The curtains instantly went flat. No sound, no breathing, nothing. The silence was so absolute that my ears rang. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept my eyes fixed on the curtains, waiting for the slightest movement, but there was none. When dawn finally broke, I approached the window with shaky legs, pulling the curtains open revealed nothing but glass and frost. The faint circular patches of condensation, however, were proof enough. A single wide oval the height of a face was fogged over in the center, and in the middle of it a long, uneven streak where something had breathed and then licked down the glass. I told myself it was a nightmare, a dream brought on by exhaustion. I even wiped the glass clean and convinced myself to go about my day as if nothing had happened. But that night, I started noticing other things. The curtains moved when the window was locked. My cat refused to enter the room, standing at the doorway and hissing at nothing. I'd wake up with a faint sensation of warm, damp air against my cheek and find the blanket slightly pulled down from where I'd left it. And always I could hear it breathing closer than before. By the third week, the nights had become unbearable. I couldn't stay in the bedroom without feeling something heavy pressing down on my chest. The faint smell of damp and something sweet metallic lingered. Even when the windows were open, the camera I had set up recorded nothing unusual during the day, but at night I could see the faint outline of movement in the corner of the footage, a slow wavering of the curtains, as if someone's body was pressing against them from the inside. It began to follow my schedule. I would wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom or grab a drink, and every time I returned to bed, the curtains would shift slightly, as if turning toward me. A cold draft seemed to emanate from the corner nearest the window, not the vent, not the walls, but from the very edge where the fabric met the frame. It made the hairs on my arms rise and forced my skin to goose flesh. The breathing had changed too. It was no longer just slow and steady. It had developed a rhythm mimicking my own heart, sometimes catching just a beat behind me like it was learning me. It would stop if I held perfectly still and restart the moment I moved my fingers or adjusted the blanket. I started leaving small objects by the window to see if they would be disturbed. A pen, a book, a cup of water every morning. Some of them would be slightly shifted or placed in different positions, not far, but close enough to make me certain I wasn't imagining it. One night, I tried to confront it. I walked slowly toward the curtain, my phone flashlight in one hand, trembling so much I could barely hold it. I whispered to it, asking what it wanted, expecting nothing, but I heard the wet, dragging inhale again and a low rasp, as if replying through the curtain. I jumped back. The fabric bulged violently for a moment and then fell flat again. The air was thick and heavy around me. From that night on, I could hear in other parts of the apartment. I would be in the kitchen and hear faint mouth breathing behind the closed door of the bedroom or in the hallway, as if the curtains themselves were moving from room to room. It had begun to assert its presence even without anyone near the window. I began to lose sleep entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the curtains swaying toward me, or heard the soft, moist, rasping inhale echoing in my head. I tried recording the sound with my phone, but each time the file corrupted. As soon as the breathing grew louder, I began to notice a strange sensation on my skin, a sort of wet warmth crawling up my arms and legs almost. Imperceptible, but enough to make me flinch every few seconds. The first time I saw it was a glimpse I will never forget. I had returned from the bathroom, and the curtain had a single bulge in the center, unlike before. The fabric lifted slightly, as if pressing against a face. I shined the flashlight directly at it, and for a brief second, I saw the pale outline of eyes and a mouth breathing slowly and wetly into the material. The eyes were hollow, yet focused, the mouth agape in a silent rasp of air. And then it vanished before I could blink, leaving only the flutter of curtains. I started sleeping in the living room, lights on fully, but it began to follow the sounds of movement. They're too faint at first, almost imperceptible, and then unmistakable. The air would feel heavy, and the breathing would appear somewhere in the corner or behind furniture. Even when the bedroom door was closed, I began to feel watched all the time, like the sound of its mouth breathing had extended beyond the walls. I stopped inviting friends over. The cat stayed out of the bedroom and refused to enter the apartment during the night. I began marking the edges of the curtain to see if it shifted overnight. Every morning the marks were slightly offset, as if something had brushed past the fabric from inside. I tried blocking the edges with tape and pins, but it continued to appear in the center of the curtain. I started keeping a notebook beside my bed, recording the times and sound. The pattern was terrifying in its regularity. Sometimes the breathing would match my steps in the kitchen exactly. Sometimes it would fall behind by a second or two. Sometimes it would stop entirely for hours, only to resume when I tried to sleep again. It was learning me, growing closer. By the end of the third week, I could no longer distinguish what was real. I would be walking in my apartment and catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye behind the curtain, and freeze. My heart would pound as I waited for the next wet rasp of breath to confirm it wasn't my imagination. I stopped leaving the blinds open and began drawing the curtains tightly every night. Yet even with them closed, the sound of mouth breathing came from them, and I knew it wasn't just air I was hearing. It was watching. By the fourth week, I could no longer pretend that the breathing was harmless or that the sound was just my imagination. The presence behind the curtains had begun to assert itself in ways that defied reason. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sensation of air moving across my face and the faint, damp rasping of mouth breathing close enough that I could feel the warmth of it on my skin. The first time it happened, I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard it behind me, a slow dragging inhale, followed by the exhale that scraped the fabric of the bedroom curtains. I froze in place, listening. The sound shifted as though moving toward the edge of the curtain. I risked looking and saw the folds moving, slightly bulging outward, then flattening in irregular pulses like a living muscle. I tried blocking the edges of the curtain with tape and pins, but it made no difference. The movement now was coming from the center of the fabric. The curtains rose in a smooth arc, as if something was pushing from behind them. The folds spread and twisted with the rhythm of the wet, rasping exhale. The shadows cast by the street lamp outside distorted the shape beneath the curtain, making it look taller than a normal human figure with elongated limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally. I grabbed my phone and tried recording video, but the camera froze each time the fabric began to bulge. I watched the screen in horror as the image warped. The sound of wet breathing became louder in the recording, though in reality it was no louder than usual. It was as if the device couldn't handle the presence and tried to erase the evidence. The next night it escalated further. I had shut the curtains completely and slept in the living room, but I heard the dragging inhale begin in the corner of that room, as if it had moved with me. I turned on every light, but the sound persisted. The wet rasping now came from behind furniture, from the ceiling, and sometimes from the floorboards beneath me. I could feel the faint brush of something cold and sticky against my ankle when I shifted in the chair. I tried calling someone for help, but my voice seemed swallowed by the apartment. Even my cat hissed and ran under the couch, refusing to emerge for hours. I stayed in the living room with the lights on. The breathing followed me around the space, and I realized with a sinking certainty that it was not limited to the bedroom or the curtains. It had learned my patterns, and it moved when I moved. One morning, I returned to the bedroom to retrieve some clothes and froze. The curtains were parted slightly from the bottom up, forming a narrow gap. The folds swayed as if something inside had just leaned back. My skin crawled when I saw faint impressions of what looked like a mouth pressed against the fabric, stretched unnaturally and dripping condensation from warm breath. I stepped back and tripped over a chair. The sound of wet rasping came directly behind me. Though there was nothing there, the air in the room thickened, and I realized it was following me from room to room now. I tried blocking the edges of the curtain with chairs and cushions, but it slipped through the smallest cracks and crevices, appearing where I least expected it. By the middle of the fourth week, the sounds and movements became almost constant. The wet rasping would begin the instant I entered a room and stop only when I left. The curtains would bulge with rhythmic pulses, sometimes forming the faintest outline of a face, other times remaining featureless, but always moving, always aware, always waiting. I could no longer sleep. I could barely eat. I began to see faint impressions on other fabrics in the apartment, faint arcs of pressure like it had pressed itself against a couch or chair. Sometimes I woke to find the blanket I had used draped over the edge of a chair in the exact shape of a head and shoulders, as if it had mimicked me while I slept. By now I knew it was not just breathing behind the curtains. It had begun to claim the space of my apartment. It was learning my routines, copying my posture, following me room to room, and the wet rasping of its breath was everywhere. The presence had become physical, though intangible, and I understood that the curtains were only a doorway for it. And I was trapped. By the fifth week, the presence behind the curtains had begun crossing the threshold of the bedroom. It no longer stayed confined to the fabric or the window. I would wake in the middle of the night to the faint, damp rasping of mouth breathing just a few feet from my face. Even with every light on, it felt like it was right there, leaning close enough to see my features. Its rhythm had grown deliberate, almost sentient, matching my own breathing, and then lagging behind just a fraction, as if studying me. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom entirely. I moved a mattress into the living room and placed every piece of furniture in front of the door and along the walls to create barriers I thought that would keep it contained. But every night the sound of wet rasping would move along the edges of the furniture, brushing my legs and ankles. The air grew heavy and warm, as if I had enclosed something alive in a tight space. One night, I tried to confront it directly. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the bedroom door step by step. The breathing grew louder and raspier. I called its name, even though I didn't believe it could respond. Nothing but the slow drag of exhalation came back at me. I cracked the door slightly. The curtain inside twitched and bulged violently, as if reacting to the breach. My flashlight illuminated nothing but the folds of fabric rising and falling with the wet rasping echoing in the room. I backed away and tripped over the couch. The breathing followed me across the floor as if it were fluid moving beneath the surface. I could feel the warmth on my ankles, the pressure on my chest, the air Shifting as if it had weight, its rhythm was no longer consistent. It would speed up and slow down, mirroring the panic in my own heart. The camera I had set up recorded something impossible on the footage. The living room appeared normal. The curtain in the bedroom was still and flat, yet faint ripples moved across the floor like water pushed by something invisible. The wet, rasping sound was captured loud and distinct, synchronized with the footage. Showing nothing moving, the device froze intermittently. As though trying to deny the existence of what it recorded, I began noticing marks on fabrics in the apartment. The blanket I slept on was damp in crescent shapes, resembling lips pressed to cloth. The edges of the couch cushions had faint impressions of fingers that weren't mine, and yet not fully human. I tried washing everything, replacing furniture, but it always reappeared. The presence had claimed the apartment. It had learned how to mimic and follow the contours of my body, leaving its traces by. Now, I was exhausted. I barely left the apartment. I stopped answering calls and messages. I had nightmares while awake. I would feel the weight of something pressing down from above my shoulders and hear the wet rasping against my ear, and when I turned, it was gone, only to resume when I faced forward again. One night, I awoke to the sensation of wet, warm air brushing my lips. I froze. The sound of mouth breathing was right next to me. I reached slowly toward the edge of the couch and touched the blanket. My fingers met nothing solid, but the fabric shifted under the pressure, almost as if something beneath it had pressed against me, mimicking the touch. I ran toward the door, and it moved after me. The sound of wet rasping followed every step, and the air around me grew thick and sticky as though it had mass. It was inescapable. It was no longer behind the curtains. It had become a tangible presence that existed in the space of my apartment, learning my movements, copying my body, and watching me in every room. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I barely ate. I sat on the couch with every light on and the curtains drawn tightly, imagining it hovering just beyond perception, waiting for me to falter. The wet, rasping never stopped, and I knew that the next night it would come closer. It would no longer hide behind fabric. And I understood then that it had been learning how to enter my life entirely, how to follow me, how to touch me, how to make my world its own. By the 6th week, I had reached a point where I could no longer tell where my apartment ended and where it began. The presence that had started behind the curtains had expanded into every inch of my space. I felt it in the walls pressing outward and in the floorboards vibrating softly beneath my feet. The air itself carried the scent of damp sweetness and metallic tang, and the wet rasping of mouth breathing was constant like a heartbeat I could not escape. I stayed awake for days, refusing to close my eyes. I barricaded myself in the living room, mattress pressed against the wall and chairs along the door, but every movement I made was followed. The sound of wet rasping would mirror my own breathing or lag, just a fraction. To make me flinch, I would turn toward corners and see nothing, but feel the presence pressing closer, learning my patterns, memorizing the exact weight of my body on the mattress. One night, I woke to a sensation of warm, moist air brushing my cheek. The rasping exhalation was right next to me. I could feel the edge of something soft and cold pressing against my face. I tried to pull back, but my limbs felt heavy and sluggish, as though the air itself had become viscous and binding. I could not move quickly enough. I felt a brush against my lips, as if something was tasting the air around me. I closed my eyes and tried to calm my breathing to match its rhythm, but it began to shift faster and slower, mimicking panic. And in curiosity, the pressure moved from my face down to my chest, my shoulders, and the mattress beneath me rippled, as though something with weight had lain down beside me, copying my every curve. I could feel wet warmth running along the fabric of the blanket and into my skin. I screamed, and it stopped for a fraction of a second. Then the air changed. The wet rasping was all around me from above, behind me, beneath me. I could feel a presence pressing against my back and chest, my limbs, my neck. I tried to roll over, but the mattress resisted my movement as though it had mass. It conformed perfectly to my body, pressing me downward into the couch and the floor. I could hear a wet inhale and exhale directly into my ear, followed by a dragging rasp across the blanket. I opened my eyes and saw nothing except shadows stretching across the room. But I knew it was there. I could feel it in every space it had claimed. I was no longer alone. I had become part of the environment of my own apartment. The night stretched endlessly. The wet rasping never ceased, and I realized that I was being observed more than physically restrained. I could sense it learning every reaction, every twitch, every breath. I took it to become intelligent, patient, waiting for me to make the smallest mistake, to merge more fully into my body, into my perception. At some point, I blacked out briefly. I awoke to find the mattress flat, the apartment silent, but the air still carried the faint, damp, metallic tang, and the blanket under me was warm as though recently disturbed. My reflection in the window was not my own fully. My eyes blinked out of sync with my own movement. My mouth opened and exhaled a rasp I had not made. I staggered back and caught a glimpse of the curtain folds behind me, swelling and moving, as if something had pressed its face against the fabric in imitation. I tried leaving the apartment. I ran to the door and threw it open. The hallway was empty, the air thick with dampness and warmth, but no sound followed me. I ran outside barefoot into the night, the city lights cold and distant. I could hear nothing outside. Yet when I looked at my hands, they bore faint impressions, as though something had been pressing against them from inside my own skin. Days later, I returned cautiously. The apartment looked normal. The curtains hung straight, the furniture in place. Nothing to suggest the presence that had overtaken it. The wet rasping was gone. I thought I might finally be free, but when I sit at my desk to write this, I feel the rhythm of my own breathing has slowed and become heavier. I sometimes catch a glimpse in the reflection of the window across the room of someone mimicking me perfectly. A wet inhale followed by the dragging exhale, a silent movement behind the glass. That vanishes the moment I turn. I'm no longer certain where I end and the presence begins. I am aware it is patient and waiting. It has learned the exact pattern of my life, and it will not leave it alone. It waits behind curtains in rooms I have not yet entered. It waits in the folds of fabric in the apartment I have grown accustomed to. It waits in the shape of my own body, and sometimes at night I can feel it breathe into the air around me, mimicking me perfectly, and I know that it has not left me. And it never will. The wet rasping behind the curtains is always there.